Thank you so much for joining us today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the webinar Body Matters and Liberation in East European and Eurasian Studies. This is the sixth and final session in the series Bodies in Focus, Power, Subjectivity, and Practice in East European and Eurasian Studies. My name is Jennifer Tischler. I'm your host for today's event. I'm Associate Director of CRICA at the University of Wisconsin, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm very glad to introduce today's event, but before I do so, I wanted to share some accessibility details and logistics. Automatic captions have been enabled for this webinar and for all Bodies in Focus sessions. If you wish to use them, you do need to turn them on yourself. Earlier today, my colleague Alicia Baca sent to everyone registered for the webinar an email with instructions on enabling captioning in Zoom. Briefly, you would need to click on the closed caption or CC icon on your Zoom menu. The event outline is available as an Access document by request, so please use the chat, which would go to the moderators to let us know if you want a link to that outline. Today's panelists will not be reading from a script, so please follow the captioning if that is supportive for you. Bodies in Focus is part of a multi-year initiative supported by the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, ASEES, in collaboration with several regional study centers in the United States. And I want to thank our co-sponsoring institutions, our scholarly consultants, for their support in this endeavor. I'd like to extend a special thank you to my colleagues Zsuzsa Magdo at the University of Pittsburgh, Alicia Baca and Emma Pratt at Ohio State University, and Sarah Lomas-Flesch at UW-Madison for their organizational support. More information about this series, including recordings of past events, is available on the website. I'm going to be partisan and give the CRICA website. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah just put the link to the whole series in the chat. We have 90 minutes allocated for today's session, with audience questions and answers reserved for the last 30 minutes or so. Audience members will have the opportunity to share questions and comments using Zoom's Q&A function, and we can also unmute audience members upon request. Please use Zoom's raise hand function to ask to be unmuted. As I mentioned, all of the panels in this series are being recorded. Subsequently, recordings are professionally captioned and made available after each session on the program web pages of the three organizing centers. And if you have any questions about accessibility, please email our colleagues at Ohio State University, and Sarah will put that email in the chat, csees at osu.edu. If you need assistance at any point during the presentation, you could put something in the chat, and that will be seen only by the moderators and panelists, and one of us will respond. A gentle reminder to myself and our panelists, we are committed to ensuring that the space we share together is welcoming, accessible, and safe. We will do our best to speak slowly, to offer visual descriptions where appropriate, and to read in full comments and questions entered as text. Now, on to our moderator and panelists for Body Matters and Liberation. I'm very pleased to introduce the moderator for today's event, Sarah Phillips, Professor of Anthropology at Indiana University. Sarah also teaches in the IU Human Biology program and is an affiliate of the Department of Gender Studies. Her research focuses on Ukraine, touching on topics of gender, disability, civil society, and social movements. She is the author of two books, Women's Social Activism in the New Ukraine and Disability and Mobile Citizenship in Post-Socialist Ukraine. Sarah's current research considers the experiences of Ukrainians with disabilities who are living as refugees in EU countries. And then the panelists for today, in alphabetical order by last name, is Balaji, or Bobby Balagun, a sociologist at SOAS, University of London. Bobby's research combines ethnographic and decolonial approaches offering innovative perspectives on the intersection of race, migration, and colonization in Central and Eastern Europe. Bobby is the author of Race and the Color Line, The Boundaries of Europeanness in Poland. Cassandra Hartplay is Associate Professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Health and Society, with affiliations in the Department of Anthropology, Center for European and Eurasian Studies, and the Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies. Cassandra also served as the inaugural director of the university's Center for Global Disability Studies. Her first book, I Was Never Alone, or Oporniki, an ethnographic play on disability in Russia. Her second book, Access Vernaculars, Disability and Design in Contemporary Russia, is forthcoming with Cornell University Press later this year. And Cassandra's current research investigates the politics of given names and the social life of the Russian patronymic in urban Bishkek. Daria Krivenas is a sociologist and senior researcher at the University of Helsinki. Her research deals with post-Soviet migration, displacement, racialization, whiteness, and labor. Daria conducted ethnographic research among Russian migrants in Helsinki and Ukrainian migrants in Warsaw. Daria currently leads a project, Life Breaking and Life Making, Social Reproduction and Survival in Times of Collapse, at the University of Helsinki. And Kimberly St. Julian Varnon is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Pennsylvania. Kimberly's research explores ideas and understandings of race, Blackness, ethnicity, and nationality policy in the Soviet Union and East Germany. Her public writing analyzes the linkages between race, foreign policy, and culture in the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, and Kimberly's writing has appeared in Foreign Policy, the Moscow Times, and the Kennan Institute's Russia file. So thank you all for giving us your time today, and without further ado, over to you, Sarah, for the panel discussion on body matters and liberation.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that wonderful introduction of our panel. I'd like to begin with a visual description of myself very quickly. I'm a middle-aged white woman with short brown hair that's parted on the side, and my color choices today are black and white in my wardrobe, and I have a very messy office behind me. So, I want to thank ACES, first of all, for organizing these 6 wonderful panels focused on body matters and other issues in our region. And I'd like to thank our Title VI partner centers all over the country who have sponsored these wonderful panels. And I would like to say, long live Title VI. So, without further ado, I'm really looking forward to the conversation with all of you, and very, very privileged to have been asked to moderate this panel. Let's go ahead and get started with our first question, and we'll ask each of the panelists to consider this question in turn. So the title of our panel is Body Matters and Liberation in East European and Eurasian Studies. So I'd like to ask each of you to briefly describe, in the context of your own research, what does authentic liberation look like, and how do you address it in your work? And I know that Bobby bravely and generously offered to go first. So Bobby, handing the virtual microphone over to you to consider this question of authentic liberation and how you address it in your own research.
Well, thanks very much, Sarah, for that very wonderful question. And quickly, I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to join this wonderful panel to discuss this very, very timely question. If you've asked me this question about 2 or 3 months back, I'll be giving you complete different answers, thinking about what's actually been going on, not only across in North America, but thinking broadly about what's been going on in Western Europe as well as in Central and Eastern Europe. And for my own work, I've often considered authentic liberation as something that's really, really centered to the voices that I try to platform within my own work. I often expect authentic liberation to be, something that manifests itself within political freedom, such as ability to express oneself openly without any concern. And in that way, I've been really, looking forward to many opportunities where I could use what might seem like authentic liberation to really bring forward opportunities, resources to actually improve livelihoods, as well as a sense of dignity and discussing concerns and issues over inequalities. But what we seem to be, really getting at the minute is not really an authentic liberation. It's a sense of liberations that seems to be really matters to particular people, depending on where these people are, depending on where they're coming from, depending on what they actually look like. So what we have is a very restrictive liberation that tends to really depends on, the categorization of particular people and wherever they are located in the world. So, for example, we've seen this lack of authenticity of liberation playing itself out in the wars between Israel and Palestine. We've seen it actually happening now with the war between Russia and Ukraine. And within my own work, I've seen this also playing itself out in terms of discussion around the identities of people that are often perceived as non-Poles. So, for example, I've often looked at the experience of people of color. And recently, I've been working with a group of Black women living in Poland who have actually been brave enough to discuss the ways in which they're actually perceived in Poland as a way of actually expressing the sense of belonging in Poland, and also the liberation of their own identity, rather than being so restrictive or being reduced to a particular sense of identity. And what we've been seeing, rather than this kind of conversation being welcoming and being very very helpful in discussing what might be a form of liberation, what we do get is often a pushback to the ways in which people will be seen as not belonging into the whole process of nation formation, and particularly in Poland. We can find similar examples in many places, but one of the ways in which I've really tried to center the notion of how we can actually use another thing, liberation, has been looking at the historical formation of a nation, looking at processes of multiculturalism that have actually existed within a particular nation. For example, in the case of Poland, multiculturalism is seen as something that that happens in the West or in North America, and also is being seen as a way of actually problematizing what the process of nation formation might look like. So by looking at historical archive and also look at process of nation formation, for example, in the case of Poland, where there has been a lot of multicultural aspect of the Polish nation, made an attempt to use that to center what might help us to really have at least an understanding of what liberation might look like in such a way that people, from different backgrounds could really get on very well. Another aspect of my work that I've actually used to center authentic liberation within my own work is working with open society NGOs in Poland as a way of platforming what could be achieved if we start giving people an opportunity to actually express themselves freely. And using these three examples, I've been able to really see we could really achieve beyond what we currently have as something that's really very less authentic, less original, that seems to be really very, inward focused, and also that seems to be very, very exclusive in nature. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Bobby. I think it's so important that you begin first talking about which bodies are even considered as as potential to experience some form of liberation. How experiences of even liberatory thinking are really historically rooted, right? And so I'm glad that you really started us out talking about nation forming and looking at, histories of non-liberation really and non-inclusion. That's very helpful, I think, as a way to start our conversation. Kimberly St. Julian Varnon, I'd love to turn to you now and have you give your own thoughts on thinking about what would our authentic liberation look like in the particular research that you do, and maybe making some connections with the points that Bobby made as well.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. I sound a little bit froggy because the weather in Texas has been wild, so forgive me. So I've been thinking about liberation, and for some reason, I taught U.S. history as a high school teacher for a while, and so I was thinking about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ideas of the four freedoms. So you have freedom of speech, freedom of belief, but also freedom from want and freedom from fear. And I was thinking about those elements in terms of what my work is and how you have thousands of foreign students, particularly African students, who go to the Soviet Union and East Germany as part of these liberatory processes, right? As they're getting freedom from colonizing powers and establishing these new states and new ideas of nation, and how both the Soviet Union and East Germany were promoting modes of liberation, but how those often turned into conflict. You had conflicting ideas of liberation when it came to the classroom or the dance club or an interracial relationship between an African and an East German or a Soviet person. So I was fascinated by how these clashes of liberation and these senses of liberation often shatter when it comes to issues of race and difference. And so that allows us to kind of imagine and to also see how physical difference, be that color, the way your body looks, the way your body moves, the way your body is read, often can be used to undermine these, universal, so-called universal ideas of what liberation is. So I think that's kind of what I do in my work, is to show how just the way we don't have a freedom of being yet, and how being can often undermine this sense of liberation or promote a sense of liberation. And I was also thinking about how Bobby mentioned, this modes of looking for and gaining access to and speaking with community, and kind of removing our focus from the constant need to have archival access. And I think that's an important part of my work, is drawing on cultural and social productions to push back a little bit against the archive, as in Soviet history, we're very much archival focused. And so liberation from the archive, thinking through and really critiquing what does it mean to have so much of our understanding and the creation of our narratives based on state-produced documents, and how certain bodies, because they do not match that of the majority, are not present in those documents. And when they are present in those documents, the words and the narratives used to talk about them may not be their own, and they may not be representative of the feelings of these people. And so I try to think about that in my work. And that's my academic work. And then in my public facing work, I think, especially since 2022, I've thought about liberation in terms of the Ukrainians in fighting against Russia, but also the African and foreign students who are having to leave Ukraine. And there are various difficulties with racism, nationalism, this paperwork, trying to get out of Ukraine, to go to Poland or Hungary or Romania, and then trying to go to a third country to seek education, right? Another form of liberation, and how often that was denied. And I've been thinking through how I, as a person who's focused on Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, what liberation looks like in that case. And for me, a key part of that is to educate people about liberation in other contexts. So for me, we fundamentally cannot divorce what we see in Ukraine from the liberatory things we saw in the 1960s in Algeria and in Ghana and in Kenya. So we have to widen our understanding of decolonization and these processes in the world to understand what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine's history is connected to the history across the African continent and across Southeast Asia. So liberating ourselves from these national understandings of history and colonization, and also deconstructing Europe and what Ukraine's meaning and belonging to Europe means, to widen our understandings of that. So that's how I've been thinking. And of course, like Bobby said, my thinking 2 months ago, 3 months ago shifted a lot. But that's how I'm thinking of it now in my public facing work and in my academic work.
Wow, that's so powerful. Kimberly, you and Bobby have already given us so much to think with. Now I'm thinking methodologically, how do we capture liberation as public-facing scholars? How do we educate the public? How do we educate our students? So many directions our conversation can go in. I'm really excited for that. Turning to you now, Daria, thinking about liberation, what true liberation looks like, and how you are thinking about liberation in your own work.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah, for this great question. Actually, I would like to continue with the question of location of certain bodies in relation to this project of liberation. And I would like to continue with the topic of race and racialization, and to start thinking of authentic liberation from a relational perspective by bringing the region into the broader politics of European coloniality and racialization. Since for a long time it was common to think of Central and Eastern Europe as having no connection to the histories of race and coloniality, but already as Bolaji and Kimberly told us, and through their work they have shown that actually the formation of national identities and imaginaries in the region, and I'm talking about Central and Eastern Europe here, has been entangled with the production of Eurocentrism, even if the region is often imagined as white, Christian, and homogeneous. And actually, this effort to produce the region as white and homogeneous has been based on the erasure of non-white people, non-white histories, in particular, the histories of Muslims and Roma in the region. So that's why I think that when we talk about liberation in the region, it's also important to locate it in relation to the global racial capitalism, EU border regime, and politics of race and racism in Europe. And I came to questions of racialization through my research among Russian migrants to Finland and Ukrainian migrants to Poland, which I started before 2022. And here I focus on their encounter with the imagined West through migration. And I do that because to them, this migration is often narrated as a certain form of liberation from post-socialist past, from the backwardness of the post-Soviet space. So in many ways, they talk about West and Europe through the narratives of progress and modernity, through the ideas of futurity. But at the same time, I think it's very important to emphasize that these realignments with whiteness and Europeanness are not as innocent, because this endeavor is based on reaffirmation of the politics of race and whiteness. And so in practice, it would mean that these questions of racialization would be lived in a very embodied matter. So these migrants would lose their social status after migration. They would narrate their stories as through the stories of exhaustion of their bodies, working in the nighttime economy, working in the service sector, which is also very gendered and racialized. But at the same time, even though they would experience this de-skilling and downward social mobility, quite often they would still try to defend their white privilege and try to distance themselves from refugees, from Muslims, from Roma, from non-white others. So I think like here already we can see this tension in the politics of Europeanness. And actually in many ways, the main kind of narratives of progress in Central and Eastern Europe has been often based on this kind of linear teleological realignment with Western modernity, with Europeanness. But here, I would like to invite to look into the other side, into the shadow side of this story, and kind of how these politics of realignment with Europeanness are based on the reproduction of politics of race and racism and whiteness. Also, on a more structural and institutional level, we can see how nowadays East Europeans becomes EU's border guards. So, for example, if we look into the new pact on migration and asylum, we see that the EU wants to ensure that the Union has strong external borders, and these borders are actually being protected and guarded by the new post-socialist EU member states. So here we can see how the participation in the project of Europeanness, integration with the EU and Europe is actually based on the expulsion on non-white others and those who can't make it into this idea of normality, Western modernity, etc. So yes, I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Really, again, wonderful frameworks for helping us think through these issues. I love how I feel like our definition of how to think about liberation is really expanding and moving in different directions, and thinking about bordering, right, is so important. And I think all three of our speakers so far have really honed in on you know, the privilege of whiteness once again, right, and the racializing tendencies. So particularly in this context that we're talking about in Central and Eastern Europe, but connecting with other world regions, which is such an important move that you're all making. Cassandra, can't wait to hear your perspectives coming from a disability studies background, anthropology. Talk to us about liberation in your own work.
Sure, thank you. It's such an honor to contribute to this conversation with the co-panelists here and the previous panels in the series. So I am an American living and working in Canada. I'm an anthropologist, a queer person. If I were maybe 15 years younger, I would probably say I was neurodivergent. I think I missed the boat on that one. But I am white and mixed Eastern European heritage myself. So I think in approaching the question of liberation in my own research, I always tell my students that it's essential to learn and study in order to name and accurately describe systems of oppression so that we can recognize them and take them on when we see them in the world. And so I started considering a critical social approach to disability in the early 2000s at a time when critical disability studies as a field was emergent. Sarah's work on disability in Ukraine was a big touchstone for me in connecting area studies concerns about the specificity of post-socialist politics with Euro-American models of disability advocacy. So in some of similar ways that we hear about sort of multiculturalism discourse belonging to the West, access and disability inclusion have also often been sort of understood in a similar way in Eastern Europe as coming from abroad. So in my forthcoming book, I look at the ways that Euro-American concepts of disability, access, and inclusion dispersed through global tools like the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as well as things like architectural norms and standards, circulate broadly and then take on particular discursive meanings in different global contexts. And in my book, I look at both online Russophone discourse broadly, as well as the politics of one Russian city and experiences of disabled people living there. And one of the things I'm interested in there is what vocabularies are actually being used to talk about disability access for people with physical disabilities, speech impairments, things like that. And I argue that there is an autogenous sort of local Russophone vocabulary of disability access that exists in Russian that has been sort of layered over with the sort of global transliterated terminology that we would all recognize from the newspaper. So that's a big part of that, the argument in that book. And I also look at then how images of inaccessible accessibility ramps, which circulated on the Russian internet in the 2010s, not by disabled people, but by regular citizens critiquing the government, actually get mobilized as a way to show, using a sort of latent Soviet logic, that the built environment is the responsibility of the government, as a way to set the grounds for the political consciousness of the people by providing their social needs, showing inadequate physical built environments that produce a sort of social inconvenience, therefore is a way of demonstrating the false able nationalism of the Russian government. That's in the book, so stay tuned. It'll be there at ACES. But as I was wrapping up this book manuscript, I was also teaching disability studies courses. And in recent years, the field of critical disability studies in North America has evolved considerably, especially in terms of a question about disability inclusion with the civil rights framework, to the idea that challenges that assumption that civil rights are enough when it comes to disability, because disabled people of color have advocated for a sort of critique of that framework, pointing out that there are many ways that a civil rights framework fails to account for the ways that racialized and colonized people are rarely served by the justice system of the nation state in which they live. Sociologist Nirmala Aravelis observes that race and disability are deeply implicated in complicated ways in the quote-unquote construction of the pathological other, in particular in the history of European colonialism and imperialism. European discourses constructed racialized bodies as pathologically different, less civilized than European bodies, and therefore intellectually and socially stunted and in need of guidance by the colonizing Europeans. So in this way, the conceptual roots of the system of oppression that we now know as ableism are rooted in modernist notions of scientific racism that categorized human bodies according to norms established with the goal of justifying European colonial projects made possible through white supremacist racial domination and exploitation of non-European body minds produced by these discourses. And so contemporary Black disability activist, organizer, and educator Talila A. Lewis, who works in the DC area, offers a new definition of ableism that's continuously evolving, but the most recent one I have is that it is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on socially constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of systematic oppression leads to people in society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. And I think we can see the roots of Lewis's work in their project against carceral logics of today in the US. And we also, unfortunately, recently saw this emergent and new discourse out of the Trump administration blaming DEI and then the addition of the A, meaning access, to their new scapegoat that is being promoted for and blamed for everything from plane crashes to the disenfranchisement and impoverishment of white rural America. So I have more to say about this, but I'll wrap it up here for now. Essentially, I'm arguing for a greater attention to exactly the kinds of historical formations of anti-Blackness and white supremacy as entwined with ableism when we look at these formations in our region. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. Before we move on to a second set of questions, I would like to give our panelists an opportunity to respond to one another, to pick up a thread that you found particularly generative from something that a colleague has said. Is there anything you want to come back to or kind of ponder before we move on to a second question?
Can I jump in quickly?
Please do, Bobby. Yes.
Thanks very much for that. It's so really refreshing listening to Cassandra talking about, the ways in which we could look at disability as a way of actually discussing, what an authentic liberation might look like. Because, I mean, historically, if we look, say, for example, in the case of Poland, the role of eugenics is really to deny many people that are seen as disabled, by putting them into very, very difficult situation by applying quite so many, lists of policies and around them, and to say the least, sterilizing many people, denying them of, many ways in which they could really express themselves freely. I think, thinking about disability as a really very interesting tool of, thinking about system of inclusion and exclusion, and in particular, what we've seen in the issue of eugenics around the region, really help us to think beyond what we might be looking at able-bodied and disabled-bodied, and beyond that, also we'll be looking at also this notion of actually who is an able-bodied, thinking also about what an able-bodied might look like in terms of describing somebody who belongs into a nation. And if I may use also another Polish example, quite often when I ask people in many of my interviews, can you describe who a Polish person is to you, or how a Polish person will be described or seen? A Polish person is often described as a really strong male person, and whiteness and ableness seems to be really dominating many aspects of definition of who actually have an able body. So there are many wonderful ideas we could draw from disability studies, where we could begin to see how bodies are actually perceived in different ways in the region.
Yes, please, Kimberly.
I think this has been, I'm taking notes constantly, and I'm thinking about, as Dario's talking about kind of these imaginations of the Western Europe, and Western Europe representing futurity and progress for people from Eastern Central Europe. And I was thinking about migration, and also how ableness is constantly the thread through migration. The difficulty of people whose bodies are read as not abled, and the strictures against your ability to move because you are not seen as someone who could contribute to the society that you're migrating to. And I saw this as I was working with people trying to leave Ukraine. I mean, people who have disabilities, who have mobility issues, simply and physically moving out of a country that was being destroyed by war was difficult. But then going to a new country and trying to find the new supports that you need literally to survive, that aren't there, or they don't want to provide those for you. But also, as we've seen with the war, you have a new generation of people who have become disabled, who now have to deal with that, and who are already displaced. And so I've been thinking about the ways in which disability becomes one of the first borders that we place onto people in terms of their belonging to the nation, but also their ability to belong to the place that they're migrating. So I have to thank Cassandra and Dara for just really kind of lighting those fires in my brain and thinking about that. But even in my own research, if you were not able-bodied, the first thing that they did to these African students, they did a health exam. And if you were not able-bodied, or if you had an illness that couldn't easily be treated, you were not allowed to leave the country to pursue studies. So this allows me to kind of think about that other boundary in terms of racialization and the reading of the body and its like connections to health. So y'all are getting footnotes in the dissertation. So thank you.
Terrific. Daria, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you everyone for these wonderful contributions. I also see many parallels between disability, racialization, and migration. And I think like one of the immediate parallels from migration studies comes from the fact that immigrants' bodies and immigrants are often seen as kind of disabled in certain ways because they don't speak the language, because they are supposedly unproductive populations, they are welfare scroungers. But in fact, we see and we know that, of course, like migrants contribute to the society, and in the end, it's not their only value and why we should value the people in the first place. And here, this form of disability is also narrated as a kind of individual failure or as individual responsibility, that people don't know the language, they don't contribute. And that's why I think that there was this very nice definition, I don't remember who said that, about the system that puts value on the bodies. I think it was Cassandra's definition, So I think it's very important to put the focus back on the system that puts value on the bodies and not seeing bodies themselves as kind of having no value or being failed or being unproductive and therefore unvalued altogether.
That's such a crucial point, Daria, and I thank you for bringing that to the fore. That question of systems, right, and those perceptions, the structures, right, that are in and of themselves disabling, and racializing, and all the other things we've been talking about. That's actually a perfect segue to the next question that I wanted to pose to the panelists. And that question is, again, thinking of these structures, right? Thinking of the systems in which all bodies are entangled and governed. Looking at your specific research, and I think it would be really helpful here to have, concrete, specific ethnographic examples if possible. How are certain bodies viewed, read, and valued or devalued in regard to belonging and citizenship in the region? And again, thinking about and why is it so, right? What are the systems and structures that make it so? So that's the question. I would ask you to keep your responses to 4 minutes or so if possible, so we'll have ample time for Q&A with the audience. Bobby, would you like to start us off again on the second round of questions?
Absolutely. Thanks for that question, Sarah. I think the question you're asking here really touches on deep social, cultural, political issues around identities, systemic inclusion and exclusion, at least from my own work looking at Poland. There are so many interesting ways we could begin to think about the ways in which bodies are viewed, read, valued, based on, several factors that include race, ethnicity, gender, social class, religion. Sexual orientation in particular is a major one that we've not really touched on. It's almost a taboo to even talk about sexual orientation in terms of sexuality in some ways in Central and Eastern Europe. It almost seems like there's only one rigid, straight sexual orientation that's just being male in many interesting ways. We've touched on ableism and disability, which is very, very interesting. And for the most part, immigration status. This is a major one that really plays out in some of the discussions I've had around my work. So, for example, the dominant social and cultural norms in Poland tend to dictate bodies seen as belonging and not belonging into the Polish society. So this body tends to be defined through whether you're white or you're black, even for the either mixed race pool or a black pool. It is often very, very difficult to get these people to really admit that, well, I belong to this nation, or my citizenship really gives me something very interesting, or that attach me to this sense of being in Poland. And in looking and thinking around the ways in which the notion of citizenship alone is being used as a form of inclusion and exclusion, particularly in Poland, we get to see the ways in which particular bodies are valued and privileged, and other bodies are seen as not able to contribute. I quite like the way you put it, and Daria, in terms of, if you cannot contribute anything, you're almost like seen as a disabled person. Therefore, you can come into Europe, or you can't stay in Poland. There's a sense of this also that really look at the defense of Europe. You got to be somebody who is able, or somebody who is fit to be able to actually, contribute to the defense of Europe. So when we look at the ways in which bodies actually been excluded, one of the really major examples that begin to emerge, and actually this has been going on for quite a while, is to think about the current standoff between Poland and Belarus, where there are still many migrant camping out between the border between Poland and Belarus. These bodies are seen as not belonging to the nation. And yet we've had several, movements of people from Ukraine, with really people, of course, with people of color having problems coming into Poland, as you mentioned, Kim. But since the period that we've had this problem with the war between Russia and Ukraine, similar thing has been going on at the border between Poland and Belarus, and yet this issue is not being addressed at all because these people camping outside the border are seen as not belonging to the nation. Even when they're coming into the nation, they are also being seen as well. This is somebody that there's a ways in which cultures and values are seen as, well, we can use this to actually define people when it comes to sense of belonging in Poland. And I found that very useful to look at what the nation is actually doing around its border, the way it's actually been describing and dividing people into categorizations that tend to define where these people are actually where they're gonna go, whether or not they'll be allowed to actually come and be a citizen in the nation. We need to think about this in a very interesting way. Some of the reasons why I will argue that many people are being kept in the border between Poland and Belarus has been to delay in the ways in which these people could become a citizen in the long run. So it's almost like a catch up or a game where eventually these people will disappear and they will go somewhere. So there are so many ways in which we could see the sense of belonging as a system of inclusion that's in many ways embedded with so many logic of whiteness and Europeanness, and also in many ways that actually use, colorism or some sort of system of not belonging to Poland to exclude many people from the Polish territory.
Thank you so much, Bobby. Kimberly, turning to you now, in your own work, how do you see certain bodies being viewed, read and valued or devalued in regard to belonging and citizenship?
So in my work, particularly looking at mixed race Soviet and East German people, so you have these universalist claims of socialist brotherhood and belonging, where every person is a citizen of the Soviet Union or East Germany, and thus they have the rights and privileges of citizenship and equality. But often what happens is the mixed race body is read as not belonging. So a perfect example is from there's a video of James Lloydovich Patterson, who is an African American and Russian Soviet person, and he is part of the 1957 kind of World Youth Festival. And the Soviet media says, James has lived his entire life in Russia, and he's gone to school with Russians, and he's really, come into Russian culture. But by doing that, the underlying tone is, but he's not Russian. He's not Soviet, although he was born and raised in the country and his mother was Russian, right? And so in that way, despite being a citizen of the Soviet Union, because of his blackness, because of his physiological difference, he is read as not Soviet, which kind of breaks down this understanding of of friendship and brotherhood. Friendship and brotherhood also have these underlying meanings of, but you have people who are friends, but they are not family. They are not necessarily belonging. And I think the limits of that type of solidarity are seen in how mixed race people are treated in the countries. Another example, just thinking about this idea of like cultural values and belonging, is why Black or brown mixed race people are seen as not belonging. And I think a key part of that is this understanding of cultural values and the reading of Blackness and brownness as being outside of that culture, be it East German or Soviet culture. These are all Western concepts of cultural belonging and progress. And the second thing is the reason why these Black and brown people are in these countries is to gain civilization and progress through socialism, to be taught how to have these things in their decolonizing countries. So in that way, the Black and brownness of these mixed race Soviet and East German people, the color, the physiological difference is tied to this lack of cultural belonging. And that leads to this exclusion of them from this belonging. And I think we see it even in the post-Soviet space. We see this in Russia, we see it in Ukraine, that for Russians and Ukrainians, and we see it still in Germany as we have the fight to recognize Black Germans, to even have them counted as people, as a type of German person. So I think these contemporary issues we see now, they long predate what's happening now. So that's kind of how I see it in my work, and then the continued issues that they face now.
Thanks, Kimberly. Turning to you now, Daria, you've worked with Russians in Helsinki, with Ukrainians in Poland. What are some examples that you can offer of how bodies are read as belonging or not belonging?
Yeah, sure. Well, I would like to go back in time and to give some examples from my fieldwork before the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022, because we could see that after 2022, there was this kind of common assumption that Ukrainian bodies have always been white and always been privileged, and this is why they were welcomed in the European Union. But at the same time, I would like to kind of complicate the story and by going back in time. So when I would arrive to Warsaw in 2020, and I would say that I would like to do research with Ukrainian migrants, a lot of Ukrainian people living in Warsaw would tell me that I would need to go to a particular bus station where I would need to see like the real Ukrainian migrants. So I think that the distinction here is clearly classed. There is a particular imagination of who is a migrant worker, who is a Ukrainian migrant. So there is a lot of effort in trying to disidentify from this positionality of a migrant worker. And so we then can see here that, well, actually, for a really long time, Ukrainian nationals were the top recipients of residence permits based on work in the European Union, and Poland was the main receiver of these labor migrants. That's why there was a particular imaginary idea of who is a Ukrainian national in the context of Poland, and my research interlocutors were very aware of that, and they would try to distance themselves from this stigmatized, classed, racialized category of a Ukrainian migrant worker. And talking about other ethnographic examples, they would tell me that how they would try to work on their accents, try to get rid of the Eastern accent, of the Ukrainian accent in Polish, or not to speak Ukrainian or Russian in public spaces, or trying to change their surnames. So here we can see that even though there is no physical difference, as in the stories that Kimberly now told us, still we can see how this particular racialized and class forms of difference are being ascribed on the bodies of migrant workers. And I think it's quite interesting itself how this category of a migrant worker in the context of Central and Eastern Europe, in a supposedly homogeneous and white space, which were already problematized, of course, this category emerges as a very racialized and classed category. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. I'm also wondering what role gender plays there as well, and I'm sure you could speak to that, and perhaps later on we can discuss that other kind of vector. Cassandra, turning to you now, and maybe ethnographic examples, and again, keeping in mind structures, right? Keeping in mind systems and how certain bodies are read through those systems. What would be your offering?
Yeah, thank you. This is also fascinating. I'm also taking detailed notes and so fascinated by what everyone's offering. As I'm thinking about how racialization and ableism are intertwined in our region, as I was just describing, I was thinking about what recent work kind of gives interesting examples of that intersection. And one example is Josephine Wagner's work that is looking at eugenicism and inclusive education in Eastern and Central Europe, in Poland, Austria, and I think Germany. And she has a few articles published in a book on the way. And one of the things she discovers is that as this sort of UN framework of inclusive education is coming in from the top down, but teachers aren't trained in it, and systems of inclusive education don't actually allow what we might call like severely disabled students to attend a regular primary school. Instead, the mandate to create inclusive education is resulting in the sort of production of certain students as a problem to educate, who therefore become labeled as disabled and designated as the inclusive class. And those are frequently classed students in Poland or racialized students in Germany and Austria, who maybe come from Muslim families, whose German is understood by teachers as not fluent, even though it very much is. It's just a different German. So I find this to be fascinating research that's working at this intersection in contemporary life. I also think of Anastasia Kayato's historical work on late Soviet culture, where she looks at the sort of surprising appearances of Soviet colonialism in disability and deaf theater of the late Soviet era in Moscow. And another ethnographic example is fellow anthropologist Michal Moravsky's work on architecture in Moscow, where he's looking at how Central Asian migrant construction workers are sort of literally hidden beside these false facades of, the new building is coming, and while they're building these epic structures representative of new Russian nationalism, they're also living in these sort of destitute conditions and being, treated very poorly by the police. In my new research, I keep coming across the scenario that parents in the early Soviet era would give children, for sort of my generation, like, in their late 30s, early 40s now, would give them a Kyrgyz last name and not a Russian patronymic and family name. But then around the time when they got their international passports at age 16, there were all these stories of violence from police if these young adults were traveling in Russia. And so one of my interlocutors told me that she had she was the only one in her entire class who kept her Kyrgyz style last name, and everyone else, their parents panicked and gave them a Russian patronymic and family name in order to potentially prevent quote unquote problems if they were to travel abroad. And we can imagine the kind of police violence that is referring to. One brief last comment, and that is that thinking about disability studies at the intersection of biopolitics and the state and race, we have a very interesting concept of debility, whereas disability is long-term severe injury or impairment. Debility is the sort of long-term low-grade chronic difference. And historian Julia Livingston has found that minors in Southern Africa, the way they used the terminology in their own language was much closer to the concept of debility and chronicity than to the idea of disability as a sort of permanent shift in status that is sort of implied by the Anglophone term. And Jasbir Puar, in looking at the way that the Israeli state makes Palestinian bodies available for injury and death, and actually not understood to be citizens or to be the objects of a sort of sovereign make live or make die, but actually somewhere in between, but constantly available for maiming and perpetually kept in a state of weakness by withholding nutrition, medical care, and adequate resources. And something that I think is a sort of latent possibility for disability studies of the Soviet, post-Soviet region in particular, perhaps less so Eastern Europe, is the question of how debility of the broader population is actually a political strategy of oligarchy, competitive autocracy, global kleptocracy, and perhaps a strategy of preventing populations from organizing and claiming civil rights that they might, should they have more energy and more capacity to organize. So I think one of the reasons that disability advocacy has less social cachet as a sort of identity group is not only that there's less of a sort of civil rights discourse in Russia, but also that everyone is experiencing chronic debilitation at the hands of the state and the state's control of the economy. So that's something that I hope to see more work on in the future. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Wow, Cassandra, that is so provocative and really gives us, I think, some great tools to think about what's happening in the here and now, and thinking about you know, disability justice as a liberatory politics that can be applied much more broadly, right, than most people assume. That it can be a very empowering space to operate from. So thank you for that. I'm sure that our panelists have responses to one another after this second round of questions and wonderful answers. I want to invite the audience to begin dropping your questions using the Q&A function. You can just click on the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type in your questions for our panelists, and then we'll take them one by one. So while our audience is getting their questions together, I'd love to invite any panelist who would like to respond to your colleagues' comments on this second question, or anything else. What has come to mind? What thought bubbles do you have? What inspirations?
Can I jump in again?
Please do, Bobby.
Thank you. I mean, listening to Cassandra, really setting out this interesting aspect in a broader way, we could start thinking about disability study as a way of really theorizing and thinking about bodies. I started thinking about Europe broadly rather than thinking about Central and Eastern Europe, because one thing that really becomes very apparent to me that the notion of looking at Western Europe and Eastern Europe separately seems to be giving an impression that, oh, this aspect of racialization might be reduced to one particular area in Europe. But when we look at, when we just lift this notion of West and the East, what we see is a circulation of similar ideas that are actually being influenced by different local manifestations. And one of the examples that really came to my mind earlier on, Kimberly, you will probably have a very good awareness of this. There's a project that Kimberly and myself are actually involved in when we look at the history of race in Europe. And the people that are actually walking around, within the same project with us, they're looking at different aspects of Europe while we're looking at Central and Eastern Europe. So what became very apparent is that you can see similar tools that are being used when it comes to even the histories of race, and you look at elsewhere, if you look at Western Europe and you look elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, you will see almost the same manifestation bringing itself forward. So I really want to encourage us to use Europe as a unit of analysis rather than just, from time to time, of course, thinking about Central and Eastern Europe as an area that has often been seen as peripheral, but for the most part, thinking in Europe broadly could be really helpful in thinking about some of the discussions that we've had here.
Thank you so much, Bobby. Thoughts from other panelists? Responses to your colleagues? Yes, Daria, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm still thinking about this question of changing names and how prevalent historically it has been across so many geographies. And it was prevalent both in my field work with Russian migrants in Finland and with Ukrainian migrants to Poland, and also historically based in Finland, how Roma and Sami names will also change to more Finnish names, like meaning white Finnish names. Also, there was this example of Kyrgyz people changing or forced to change names into Russian names just to escape police violence. And here I'm also thinking of Miglena Todorova's work on how Muslim women in Bulgaria, in socialist Bulgaria, were also forced to change their Muslim surnames also to comply with a particular idea of socialist Bulgaria as white. And kind of how these histories can be also easily forgotten when we try to return to maybe more kind of romanticized vision of second, third world internationalism that I think Kimberly said about kind of how Black students were taught how to decolonize their own countries while being in the Soviet Union. So yeah, just thinking about like the violence of changing names and surnames and kind of what it tells us about the workings of these systems of oppression and how it is really very embodied.
Thank you, Daria. We'll encourage the audience members to offer your questions in the Q&A if you like. You can also just use the raise hand function and ask to be unmuted, and you can offer your question that way. So we'll be looking for your questions. Yes, Kimberly, please go ahead.
I am fascinated by the topic of debility, and I this is the first time I've heard it, and I'm struck by it because it's also, I like this kind of reframing of what disability means, but also kind of taking it out of, if we look outside of the American and kind of Canadian context, what that means for people and how, and it's also, I was thinking about a case it was the early 2000s, where an African who was living in Russia, he was attacked by skinheads and he was beaten horrifically, and he survived, but he was in a vegetative state. And so you have these discussions among like the local group of African people who were trying to support him. And, the people who did it, they got a ticket. And they were like, but the damage that you've done to him, like you can't undo that. And a ticket does not seem, enough for this damage. But they were also talking about, you didn't just hurt him by putting his body and mind in this state of not being able to function. You've hurt his family at home who were dependent on him getting an education to be able to get, bring more income. So I'm thinking about like the ways in which our bodies are not just our own, but they're part of our communities and our families, and how like debility kind of allows you to get at this, but also to show, even if we're in the structure where our bodies are necessary to produce value, we still can, even if our bodies do that differently. And so like a reclaiming of that, understanding you're in the structure that requires your body to be read as productive, but being able to push back against that and say my productivity and the way I do that may not look like yours, but it's still so. And it's just fascinating to me because I taught public school and I've taught students who are disabled, and to see this language, I wish I had this language to teach to them then, because I think it would have been really beneficial in terms of ownership, but also recognizing their own power and agency. So, Cassandra, thank you for this. This is really good. So I'll be passing that along to some friends who are teaching kids who really could benefit from that.
Wonderful. Well, I have another question for you all. It's a little bit, I'm sorry to spring this on you, but you're talking about language for teaching, Kimberly, and I'm also thinking about, in this moment where everything seems to be turning upside down all over the world, and we're all trying to be part of particular communities and frankly, teach ourselves and one another how to be a good community member. How do we come together in this moment? Thinking specifically about bodies and liberation in our part of the world. What might be some of your strategies for teaching about these issues? What's on the top of your reading list right now? What are you reading that's inspiring you? What are you telling your students and your colleagues that they should be reading? I'd just love to hear about, whose work besides your own. Obviously, you're all inspiring all of us here. But whose work do you think is key right now? Who's on fire, as they say? And anyone who has ideas, please jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in.
Uh-huh.
I'm happy to jump in again. It's quite interesting. I like what you said about whose work you're reading, whose work is on fire now. And I think for me, Stuart Hall's idea of race as a floating signifier, it's always on fire. It's almost like it doesn't matter any way you put it, or any society you put that idea, it seems to be very, very catchy. It seems to be signifying something. What seems to be really, I mean, my understanding of it, it's almost like you think about race as something that actually is in the air almost everywhere. It depends on the local manifestation that will pull it in different directions, that will give different meaning to it in different places. So I do find sword arts, work really very, very useful, very, very wonderful, and still very, very relevant today, despite the long existence of this word. Another person that I found very useful that my students really embrace very much, bless him, is Charles Mayall's The Racial Contract. The racial contract is a major one for me because it seems to me that almost everybody is written into this, unspoken or written contract that some people, the social contract that many people are not actually aware of, they are signed up to, and they are just forcibly being slotted into these, different kind of contract, the social contract that you're not really aware of. And there are so many interesting ways that race plays a major role in defining who actually get the best contract in terms of social contract and who get actually, the worst contract. So I find both work, very, very interesting. If I may say just one more last, it's a work of a very leading British scholar, Gominda Bambara, really encouraging us to think about varieties of European colonialism. So in a way, we often think about colonialism with a really long focus and fixed focus sometimes on Western Europe and largely North America. And Gominda is encouraging us to actually think about, there's no fixed particular aspect of colonialism. We could look at what's been done in the West, think about historical account of what colonization or decolonization might be doing in places like Central and Eastern Europe, and try to link that globally. I found that very, very useful.
Terrific. Thank you. Who else wants to offer your greatest hits? Daria, please go for it.
Well, just to continue with Bolaji's reading list, and actually thank you, Bolaji, for thinking about Stuart Hall, because I was really kind of zoned out by the question what is on fire now. But I started really thinking about the moral panics and policing the crisis, which I think is also kind of on the top of my reading list at the moment. And I think it's kind of never really goes away. About how moral panics are like in the context of Britain. Well, he wrote it how this panic was manufactured about so-called mugging, and then was used to justify increased policing. So I think it helps us understand how also the idea of crisis, which is not really a recent thing. It's not only like recently that we started talking about crisis, but I think it's important to think about crisis as being productive and being manufactured on purpose, and kind of how the narratives of crisis can justify tougher laws, increased policing, the closure of the borders, and shifts towards authoritarian powers. And at the same time, I think it's important to think about how crisis is being lived as an everyday reality, as an everyday conjuncture, as the ordinariness among the communities that were for a long time on the receiving end of these punitive measures and the governance of racialized precarity, and kind of how, coming back to the other question that you asked, what does it mean to be a good community member? And I think that kind of living in these chronic conditions of crisis, living as a racialized subject or sexualized subject with disabilities, I think it helps us to think kind of how crisis is a more chronic condition at the same time as crisis is being constantly manufactured by the power.
Kimberly?
So I think I've been reading a lot of fiction, as we all do, to escapism. Reading a lot of horror novels, because those have nice endings, and especially Stephen King, the evil always loses. So I like to read that right now. I've been thinking about, in terms of accessibility, not necessarily academic texts, but I've been doing a lot of talking with family. A lot of my family lived through Jim Crow, and I've been talking to them about survival and what did that look like in these processes, and how do you maintain sanctuary, whatever that may be, home, family, um, in times of chaos, in times of crisis. And so that's been helpful. It's also been kind of earth-shattering that to have those conversations in 2025. Um, but I've been thinking about and reading Joan Didion. I've kind of gone back to Joan Didion and Slouching Towards Bethlehem, but also The Year of Magical Thinking, because my family's recently experienced some loss. Toni Morrison, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination has been helpful in terms of thinking through my own work into the cultural constructions of Black characters and their meaning to and their meaning for national belonging, but also national exclusion. Um, but also I think a key part of this is as we look for community, thinking about what we bring to those communities, but also what do those communities mean to us and how to uplift people, if that's baking food for people who are going through a rough time, watching the children of people who need just a break from, the chaos of raising small children right now, walking dogs, petting cats. But also I think for me it's been contributing to my environment, um, cleaning out bird feeders because we have bird flu going around. Like these little things I think that keep us rooted to what's actually happening in the reality. And I think as academics, it's very easy to keep our heads in the clouds in terms of theory and constructions. And sometimes I think we just have to, I literally, because I taught teenagers, you got to go touch grass. And I found myself doing that a lot, is trying to go outside and just root myself in the things that I know are real and concrete. So that's kind of what I'm doing, but also listening to lots of good music, I think is also important. Sometimes you need to dance, you need to move around, you need to feel. So Depeche Mode's kind of been keeping me going a lot, as also Al Green and Marvin Gaye sides, bouncing through these things. But I think that's been important to me too, is to root myself in community, but also to root myself in the things that sustain me outside of the academy. Has been really important.
That's great, Kimberly. I'm totally with you. Music as a space of liberation, like all day, all the time. Cassandra, you gave us some wonderful reading recommendations. Julia Livingstone on debility. You mentioned Moravsky's book. Is it a book on Moscow, on Central Asian workers?
There's an article in American Ethnologist, I think. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and if people want to read more about disability justice, I recommend the 10 Principles of Disability Justice from Patty Byrne, Berne. You can find it online. And then Sammy Shalk's book, Black Disability Politics, and Leah Lakshmi, Pipnat Samara Sinha's book, Care Work, are sort of like recent touchstones that have been around for a few years now, but are just a great place to go for that consideration. And I also want to shout out Kaji Liedlach, who is on one of the previous panels, who's doing kind of queer and disability, feminist, intersectional, anti-imperialist work about Central Europe. I guess for me, this question is so interesting. I've been really thinking about the sort of rise of what a colleague of mine at U of T is called, Lucan Way, is calling competitive autocracy, and like what Masha Gessen might call a heteropatriarchal kleptocracy or something like that, right? So I'm trying to find words to describe what's happening in US politics right now, not as an isolated incident, but as part of a long-term global plan to implement the rise of the far right by pushing back civil rights gains that have occurred over the past century. And, particularly as a queer person with a child, that's extremely terrifying. As a sister to a Black woman who lives in the US, that's particularly terrifying. I think it's something everybody is going through, but I'm also looking to the queer and feminist activists that I know in Russia and in Central Asia who have sustained themselves through the rise of this type of regime, through a real commitment to building community through activist art spaces and these sort of like quiet, small bubbles of queer joy or colonized joy that come through making things together, whether or not the rest of the society that you're living in are going to understand or promote those things. Colleague Mohira Suryalakalova in Bishkek, who's working on a project about queer joy in like the current regime in Kyrgyzstan, which had been a regime that was thought of as a sort of bastion of civil rights and civil society in Central Asia, and was long throughout the 2010s home to the most progressive queer NGOs in the region, have now since 2022 been systematically shut down when the new president just started taking laws that they had passed to protect trans rights just literally off the books, just disappearing from the internet. A story that I thought was so far-fetched and bonkers when I heard it in 2022, only to now experience it happening in the US. And so what I've been thinking about is burnout and the reality that these tactics of exhaustion and bullying and hate online are actually intended to prevent people from organizing, to prevent people from sustaining resistance, and from finding each other. And so I think Kimberly's comments really resonated with me about finding those spaces of sanctuary, family, and home, whether it's chosen family or family of origin, to sustain ourselves in a time when it's impossible to not be threatened by burnout, and that to recognize that as an actual tactic of autocracy or kleptocracy or fascism or whatever you want to call it.
Thanks, Cassandra. That's so important. Really appreciate your perspectives. So I'd like to invite our panelists to offer any final words that you would like to, either looking towards your future research, thinking about inspirations you've had during our discussion that kind of helped you think about liberation in new ways, just anything you'd like to close out with before we conclude our session.
Happy to start again.
Thank you.
That's okay. Okay. It's very, very interesting listening to Kim and Cassandra, as well as Daria. I think I've learned quite a lot. And I mean, especially in the last few comments, it just come to my mind that grassroots mobilization is really a key. No matter how small it is, it's really one of the many ways in which we could try to, hold on to what we've got in terms of solidarity. I mean, it's a very crucial time to be alive, thinking about, America shocked most people in the world, especially people in Europe, with the election of Trump, and then there were all the ways in which negotiations, about how the war in Ukraine is going to stop, and also the war in between Israel and Palestine. And I think there's no more time that's so important for us to really hang on to very interesting solidarity, grassroots mobilization, and stay very close, stay very strong, try not to change the stance. Over time it will change because as a sociologist, I look at myself as somebody who was so much in love with history. It's almost like everything that's happened or that's happening now has happened before. It's almost like a repeat of Nazism and fascism coming back to life. So it's not new to us, and it was dealt with at the time. And I believe we can actually deal with it now with even more better resources than before. We will get past all this difficult time.
Thank you, Bobby. That's great encouragement. Kimberly.
I think that just listening to everyone, like I've written 3 pages of notes, but I was thinking about Cassandra's point about turning to the region and the women and the queer activists and the groups who've gone through this. And I think that I found myself reading more about the Brezhnev era. And I work, I live and breathe Stalinism, but I've gone to the Brezhnev era. And I was thinking about how when I first read about the Soviet PhDs and scientists who decided to work as janitors. And, it seemed wild to me, 10 years ago. And now I'm like, oh, I understand now. So I think looking back and learning from the communities, the cultures and societies we study is very valuable right now. And I think, and the same thing with my study and teaching of US history, going back to and reading about survival under Jim Crow in the 20s and 30s. So I think that's been important to me, is to really look at history as a framework, like, okay, this has happened before, and we have tools now to understand these processes. So I think for me, it's holding on to the resilience of good. And I mean, like I said, I work on Stalinism, so I'm reading about the terror, I'm reading about the Holodomor. There is still a resilience of good in people, and I try to remind myself of that, and to teach people about that, and to really encourage that, because I think Cassandra's right. The burnout, the exhaustion, and when that exhaustion and burnout become kind of a throwing over the hands and like, okay, this is what this is, and I can't do anything. It's a belief. It's a false belief, but it's a belief that's necessary for fascism to continue, is that you can do nothing. And so I learned a lot from learning about the Soviet Union and how people responded to that, learning about African students and how they, facing the Soviet government, they threw it back into the Soviet government's face when they protested. Um, so I think that that's been really important to me, is to really try to reach in and learn from the subjects that I've studied so long, and they still teach us. I think then the last thing is, if you're in the classroom, learning from your students, because especially if you're K through 12, um, the imagination of youth is very strong. And I think it helps me not be so cynical, because they still see possibilities. And I think it's up to us to keep them believing in those possibilities.
Thanks, Kimberly. Daria or Cassandra, any final words you'd like to share before we close our session?
Well, I could just maybe add that this session was quite inspiring for me, because it reminds us that it reminds us of the importance of theorizing from the body, and thinking of geopolitics through the body, thinking of violence through the body, because I think that in the context of Central and East European area studies, I think that we have this prevalence of grand geopolitical narratives. Many things are analyzed as kind of some very abstract, disembodied power relations, which are supposedly like disconnected from our bodies. But I think that we should actually start with theorizing the violence in the bodies and what the violence does to our bodies. So I think that the body in general has kind of quite disappeared from our understanding of what is happening in the region. And instead, this kind of very disembodied narratives of geopolitics are taking prevalence. I think that we could change that to begin with.
I just want to say thank you, and that I have learned so much from all of you. And I really want to thank the organizers for putting us in conversation, because it's just absolutely a delight to learn from all of you. So thank you. I hope we stay in touch. And also nice to see a lot of names of people I don't know out there on the participant list. I hope we also get to be in touch in the future.
Cassandra, you gave me the perfect segue here, but first, the resilience of good. Thank you for that, Kimberly. I'm going to hold that with me for the rest of today and for a long time. So thank you all for joining us today. On behalf of the organizing centers, ASEES, and all co-sponsoring institutions, let me again thank Sarah, Bobby, Cassandra, Daria, and Kimberly for such a deeply meaningful conversation. Before we close for the day, I do want to remind everyone that the recording of today's panel will be posted online in a few days once it is professionally captioned, and that recordings of past sessions are already available. And I'm just going to put that, sorry, in the chat again. And with that, thank you again for joining us today, and be well, everyone.